Kyle wanted to keep racing and stay active. That way he could race against Brexton. To have that moment of symbolization for Kyle and just see Brexton standing there, there's a moment of, wow, he's gone. And we're not going to get him back.
For nearly 2 decades, Kurt Busch and his younger brother Kyle raced against one another before either man could have pictured the conversation Kurt would eventually be forced to have in public. The two grew up in Las Vegas, pushed toward racing early by their father Tom, a mechanic who kept the family around cars long before either son ever climbed into a stock car professionally. Kurt reached the top level first, and Kyle followed a few years behind him, and the rivalry that grew between them became one of the defining threads running through NASCAR for most of the 2000s and 2010s, two brothers chasing the same prizes and refusing to hand each other anything on track. By January 2026, that old rivalry had settled into something closer to pride. Kurt was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame that month, and Kyle stood on stage as the one who presented him, telling the crowd that watching his older brother believe in himself long before the wins ever came had meant something to him personally. Kurt later described the night as one of the best of his life. Together, the two hold the record for the most combined Cup Series victories of any siblings in the sport's history, a detail that made what happened 4 months later almost impossible for the people closest to them to process. Kurt had already stepped away from full-time competition back in 2023, closing out a driving career that stretched more than 20 years, and moving into a mentorship and ownership role instead. That shift came after he spent years managing the lingering effects of a serious crash in 2015, and rather than leaving the sport altogether, he found a new place in it as a team owner and elder statesman, while Kyle kept racing full-time for Richard Childress Racing. Kurt's own numbers stand on their own. 34 Cup Series wins across 776 starts, a win at the 2017 Daytona 500 that capped one of the more unlikely comeback runs the sport had seen, and a rare sweep of the All-Star Race and the Coca-Cola 600 in the same night back in 2010. Those accomplishments put him among NASCAR's 75 greatest drivers and earned him a permanent place in the Hall of Fame, a legacy Kyle had spent much of his own career trying to match and eventually surpass. It meant that for Kyle's final season, Kurt was mostly watching from the outside, the way millions of fans were, trading a helmet for a headset and a seat in the booth instead of behind the wheel. He still showed up at the track and still offered advice when it was asked for, but for the most part he had become a spectator too, right up until the week that changed everything. Kyle had been dealing with what looked like an ordinary sinus infection while racing at Watkins Glen on May 10, 2026, mild enough that he simply asked his team for a doctor to give him a shot after the race and moved on with his schedule. Nobody around him realized the infection was already starting a slow, dangerous progression that wouldn't fully show itself for another 11 days. He kept working through it. He won a Truck Series race at Dover less than a week before he died, finished 17th in the All-Star race, and even showed up at the opening of a go-kart track with his 11-year-old son Brexton in the days that followed. From the outside, he looked like a busy driver managing a minor bug while getting ready for the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, one of the sport's marquee Memorial Day weekend events. Then, on Wednesday, May 20th, while testing in a racing simulator in Concord, North Carolina, Busch became unresponsive. A 911 call later obtained by reporters described him experiencing shortness of breath, overheating, and coughing up blood the day before he died, with a caller found on a bathroom floor telling dispatchers he was still conscious. Paramedics took him to a hospital in Charlotte, and his family said publicly only that he had been hospitalized with a severe illness and would not be racing that weekend. Less than a day later, on Thursday, May 21, 2026, Kyle Busch died. He was 41. 2 days after his death, the Busch family released a statement explaining that a medical evaluation had found severe pneumonia had progressed into sepsis, causing rapid and overwhelming complications. A death certificate obtained later by reporters filled in more of the picture, showing Kyle had likely been experiencing symptoms of bacterial pneumonia for days or even weeks before sepsis set in. Sepsis is a life-threatening emergency in which the body's own immune response, rather than simply fighting off an infection, begins damaging its own tissue and organs. In Kyle's case, that led to disseminated intravascular coagulation, a rare and serious blood clotting disorder, which then triggered hemorrhagic shock. Some doctors who reviewed the case afterward suggested the physical strain of simulator testing, which mimics the forces drivers feel on track, may have added stress to lungs that were already dangerously inflamed. Medical professionals who spoke with reporters in the days after also noted how fast the illness turned once it reached its final stage, with a certificate suggesting the sepsis and resulting shock played out in roughly a day, a pace that reportedly surprised physicians used to treating severe infections. For a family that had spent decades inside a sport built around visible, physical danger, the idea that a sinus infection could take Kyle's life within 11 days was almost impossible to square, and that disbelief is what eventually poured out of Kurt once he found the words to speak about it publicly. Kurt didn't say anything right away. It took more than 2 weeks after his brother's death for him to post his first public statement, which arrived on Instagram on June 8, 2026, alongside a collage of old family photographs. He thanked fans for the support that had come in and looked back on the two of them racing anything they could get their hands on as kids, from big wheels all the way up to competing on NASCAR's biggest stages as adults, describing what they had as something built on far more than competition. He wrote that no trophy or championship could ever measure the impact his brother had on his life, adding that his heart was broken, but that he knew Kyle's spirit would stay with him. He closed the post by telling his younger brother to rest easy. Kurt's grief resurfaced in a more visible way roughly 3 months later, in a preview clip from a NASCAR docuseries released in mid-August 2026. In the clip, he grew visibly emotional talking about how fatherhood had reshaped Kyle's priorities in his final years, explaining that as Brexton got older and started racing himself, Kyle wanted to stay active specifically so he could one day compete against his own son, the same way their father Tom had once pushed both of them into the sport. Kurt described watching Brexton stand beside his mother Samantha during the memorial ceremony held for Kyle, and admitted through tears that the moment forced him to fully accept that his brother was gone and wasn't coming back. Kyle's widow Samantha had broken her own silence a few days before Kurt did, posting on Instagram on Friday, June 5th, that the outpouring of support from friends, family, and strangers had carried them through the hardest days of their lives. She described the family as absolutely shattered while thanking everyone who had shown up for Brexton and Lennox in the weeks since their father's death, a sentiment Kurt has echoed nearly every time he talks about Kyle's family since. Kurt wasn't the only person close to Kyle working through disbelief that spring. Dale Earnhardt Jr., who had spent years as one of Kyle's toughest rivals before the two built a real friendship around show track and late model racing, said on his own podcast that he had been texting with Kyle the day before he passed. The two were finalizing plans for Kyle to drive one of Earnhardt's late model cars in an upcoming Cars Tour race, with Kyle asking specifically to run the number that once belonged to Earnhardt himself. Their last exchange ended on a light-hearted note, something Earnhardt later said became almost unbearable to think about once he learned what happened only a day afterward. Richard Childress, the team owner who guided Kyle through the final stretch of his Cup Series career, gave his own emotional account weeks later at a press conference that had originally been scheduled to announce a contract extension for the 2027 season. Instead, Childress found himself remembering a driver he had once been warned would be too difficult to manage. He recalled talking to Kyle by phone the night before he was hospitalized, with nothing suggesting anything serious was coming, and compared the loss to that of Dale Earnhardt Sr., whose fatal crash at the 2001 Daytona 500 Childress had also lived through as a team owner. He said it was almost impossible to process losing two of the greatest drivers the sport has ever produced under his own roof. That grief eventually spilled into an unexpected debate that Kurt himself helped stay. As a newly inducted Hall of Famer, Kurt now holds an actual vote in future induction decisions, and when reporters asked whether NASCAR should fast-track Kyle into the Hall given the circumstances, Kurt pushed back gently, saying he believed the sport should stick to its normal process rather than rush it, even while making clear he thought his brother belonged among the strongest candidates the Hall has ever considered. It was a notable moment of restraint from someone who had every emotional reason to want his brother honored immediately, and it said something about how seriously Kurt takes the institution he now helps oversee. By the time of his death, Kyle stood as the winningest driver across NASCAR's 3 National Series combined, with 234 total victories spanning the Cup, Xfinity, and Truck Series, a number Childress has said publicly he doesn't expect another driver to match, pointing to Kyle's status as the all-time wins leader in both the Truck and Xfinity Series. His 63 Cup Series wins ranked 9th all-time. He won 2 Cup Series championships, in 2015 and 2019, along with 2 regular season titles, and he kept racing right up until days before his death, winning that Truck Series event at Dover less than a week before he was hospitalized. The pre-race tribute held before the Coca-Cola 600 turned an ordinary holiday weekend race into something closer to a public memorial, with roughly 95,000 fans in the stands at Charlotte Motor Speedway. NASCAR painted a black number 8 into the infield grass beside Kyle's old pit stall. Every car in the field carried a decal in his honor, and the field ran a missing man formation during pace laps while the broadcast and public address system went silent on the 8th lap. Kurt joined his parents, Samantha, and Kyle's children Brexton and Lennox on the front stretch that evening, laying 8 white roses across the painted number as a bagpiper played. Daniel Suarez, a driver Kyle had personally mentored, went on to win that race and dedicated it to the Busch family through tears in victory lane. Childress later confirmed that Kyle's number, redesigned around his own input during his years with the team, will not be permanently retired but instead set aside for Brexton whenever he's ready to race at NASCAR's top level, giving Kurt's nephew a direct path to carrying his father's name forward on the track. For now, that responsibility rests largely with Kurt, who has spent 2026 balancing the role of grieving brother with that of public steward for a career that reshaped what winning across NASCAR's National Series actually looks like. From the emotional Instagram post to the tearful docuseries interview to his careful comments on Hall of Fame timing, every public word Kurt has offered since may reflect someone trying to honor his brother's memory with the same steadiness Kyle was known for behind the wheel, even while the grief keeps catching him off guard, whether through an old photograph, a race broadcast, or simply watching his nephew climb into a car the way Kyle once did as a boy in Las Vegas. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.